In this two-part video, we are looking at the cosmological argument as presented and then criticized by William Rowe. And in part one, we'll just focus in on how he presents the argument. And then in part two, we'll go on to his main task of criticizing the argument. Now, some preliminaries are needed here. One is his idea or this concept of a dependent being that plays an important role in the argument. And a dependent being for Rowe is a being whose existence is accounted for by the causal activity of something other than itself. The common things that we are familiar with are dependent beings. The screen you're looking at is a dependent being. We're using the word being very broadly to include things, people, animals. It doesn't matter what it is. It's a broad category. So the screen you're looking at is an entity, a thing that only exists due to the causal activity of something other than itself. Other people were involved in constructing, designing, putting this together, selling the whatever it is that you're looking at. So that's a dependent being. And that's somewhat similar to when Aquinas presents his cosmological argument. And we've talked about contingent beings, beings that could exist but could also fail to exist. But this is a different definition, different concept. Another concept that Rowe uses that is extremely important here is the idea of a self-existent being. Now, this being is very unique. It is a being whose existence is accounted for by its own nature. Now, in this case, we don't have a lot of common examples that could be provided, and even the ones that might be provided would be maybe controversial examples. And so we're not going to try to illustrate this with any example. We just have our definition, a being whose existence is accounted for by its own nature. So that's in contrast, obviously, to the dependent being whose existence is accounted for by something other than itself. So let's go ahead and look at the argument. The first premise, then, is that everything falls into one of those two categories that we just talked about. Every being that exists, every being that will exist, that ever have existed, is either a dependent being or a self-existent being. It needs to fall into one of those two categories. You either account for its existence by something else or by itself. And then, of course, not every being can be a dependent being. That means that you can't have merely dependent beings whose existences are accounted for by some other causal activity, something apart from itself. So we're going to spend a lot of time here on premise two. And of course, therefore, we can conclude if not everything's a dependent being, then there must be a self-existent being. Now, Rowe doesn't go beyond that at this stage, or at least at this part of the argument that we're concerned about. He thinks that this is the crucial step, the crucial part of reasoning in a cosmological argument. So this is the stage that he's focusing on. Now, in support of the premises, Rowe goes on to propose a principle. He proposes the principle of sufficient reason to support the truth of the two premises. Now, notice this is a simple, valid deductive argument. So we're not going to question the structure of the argument. It is a valid deductive argument, fairly common disjunctive syllogism. And so we don't really need to pursue that. Instead, we just need to provide support for the truth of its premises. Okay, so what he says is we have the principle of sufficient reason. It's this principle of reasoning that we have where you say that there needs to be sufficient reason for something else. And there are two parts, or you could call this two different versions of the principle. Probably better to say there are two versions of it. But A says there must be an explanation of the existence of any being. Anything that exists, there must be an explanation for why that thing exists. Okay, and then we have a second version of our principle of sufficient reason, and that is there must be an explanation of any positive fact whatsoever. And so that's a stronger principle, we might say. So the first one's focusing in on the things that exist. The second, focusing in on the facts that are true. Now, if the principle of sufficient reason version A is true, then there wouldn't be any beings that are explained by nothing. Every being would have an explanation, obviously, and therefore everything that exists is either explained by something else, and that means it's a dependent being, or it's explained by itself, which of course is a self-existent being. So because of this version A, we have reason to believe our first premise. So everything's either one or the other. So you have the support for the first premise there. What about the second premise? Let's consider support for it. Well, if there's a finite chain of dependent beings, then there must be a self-existent being at the start of the chain, right? That seems to make sense. It seems intuitive, certainly the kind of thing that Aristotle and Aquinas would seem to endorse. But somebody might object here, and Rowe examines this objection. There might be an infinite chain of finite beings. Now, actually, Aristotle seemed to say that that could be true. Now, then we say, well, suppose there has been this infinite chain of dependent beings. Suppose that's correct. And so you don't have a start of the chain directly, and then from there it's infinite, right? Suppose we have an infinite chain of dependent beings going forward and backward. Now, if every being were a dependent being, there could be an explanation of all the individual beings, right? The one that existed prior to it. However, this is the concern now, there would not be an explanation of the fact that there is and always has been dependent beings. So clearly we're getting into the second version of our principle of sufficient reason. And 5 then is contrary to that principle, the second version that says there has to be an explanation of every positive fact. So 5 says there wouldn't be one. 6, relying on the principle of sufficient reason version B, says there must be one. And so we conclude that there must be a self-existent being to explain the infinite chain. So that's the argument. That's the cosmological argument according to Rowe. He's provided some support for it. Now, Rowe doesn't think that the argument succeeds. And so in part 2, we're going to consider why he thinks it failed.